our Ukrainian community to.
There we go.
Okay.
I hear it.
Sorry about that.
There it is.
And so, there we go. So first, a little about me. Again, my name is Fylonenko. I am Ukrainian American. I was born here, but my grandparents, both sides, are Ukrainian, immigrated here after World War II. I'm proud Ukrainian. I went to Ukrainian school every Saturday. I speak at, part of the Ukrainian dance group, part of our Ukrainian church, St. Mary's Protectress, right down the street from here in 8 Mile and Evergreen, vice president of the board there. And what's going on right now in Ukraine is affecting our Ukrainian community deeply. Myself, I was born here, and again, my parents immigrated here, but we also have a lot of, we call them new waivers in our community, folks who immigrated after the fall of the Soviet Union, where it's direct, they have direct family there right now who have had to flee or have been directly affected by this. My wife in particular had family in Kiev, and they had to flee to the west of the country when Putin started invading. And so this impacts us indirectly and many of us directly. And I know you've all seen the images on TV. It's tough to watch, and especially for the Ukrainian community who have direct family there, it's even more difficult. And so, again, back to our committee, we formed it a month and a half ago when Putin started amassing, and our goal is to right now drive donations, drive medical supplies, tactical supplies, because they need this now. They need this help now. They don't have days, they don't have weeks, they have hours. They're getting bombed right now. And so our goal is to get these medical and tactical supplies as quickly as possible over there. And so, we absolutely are taking humanitarian aid as well, non-perishable food and lightly used clothing, but that's tertiary to our main goal is to really, the surgical aid, help the territorial defense, help the civilians who are being murdered right now. The civilians need bulletproof vests right now. And so if you go to our website, uacrisisresponse.org, we have a list of everything we're looking to gather. We're using, we're gathering at the Ukrainian Cultural Center Monday through Friday. And then it's being taken to a warehouse in Hamtramck, which is it's then being shipped out to the East Coast, and then from there to Poland, where we'll get it into Ukraine. So that's our main goal right now. And I'm sure many of you know people that are Ukrainian. Reach out to them, see how they're doing, see if they need any help. It always helps, and prayers as well. Our prayers, typically our church services have 50 to 100 people. We've had 200 people every service since this invasion happened, and non-Ukrainians as well, right? Across the board, we've had people join us in prayer. So, prayer, if you're able to pray for us, during your services, that always helps as well. People of faith, people across the board need to gather together, because this not only affects the Ukrainian community, it's going to affect us eventually. It's going to affect economically, right? But the Ukrainian community knows that Putin's not going to stop at Ukraine. He won't. And so, I'm not here to get political, but it's going to affect us one way or another as part of NATO or whatnot. So we're here to just raise awareness and ask for help in any way you can. Again, donations, right? We have credible nonprofits on our website. We ourselves are not a 501c3, so we're directing people to credible organizations that are tax exempt.
The Episcopal Church Fund is receiving funding for Ukraine at this point.
And so, that gives you an overview of what our community's done so far. We've had rallies downtown with, local congresspeople joining in. The local public officials have been very supportive of our cause. And we see this as a bipartisan issue, right? Helping Ukrainians, right, defend their homeland. And, the outpouring support has been immense already, but it's 2 weeks into this, and who knows how long it could go, right? Who knows? And so, the situation is extremely urgent, and if if anything, go to our website after we're done speaking, and we absolutely looking for volunteers. We've gotten emails from people in Traverse City looking to house the refugees already, right? The refugees aren't here yet because visa restrictions are still haven't been lessened for refugees yet, but we've received such an outpouring of support, and anything will help. So we appreciate your time, and I'll pass it off to Borys Potapenko now. He's been in touch with his family in Ukraine, and he has a unique view on what's going on in the context of what's going on. Thank you, Borys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Father Steve, congregants. I want to create a little bit of context for us as Americans as to what's going on 7,000 miles away. Sure, I have family in Kyiv. They refuse to leave. They're staying because, just like all the other Ukrainians, they are determined to defend their homeland. They are determined to defend their homeland with their lives because they understand that this is an existential struggle for Ukrainians as a nation, as a people. And it is a reckoning for Vladimir Putin and his regime. As an American, I can talk to you about so many terrible, tragic, horrendous situations in the world, from Somalia to Myanmar, from Libya to the fighting people in China who are also facing a genocide. And your congregation and faith-based relief organizations that you are affiliated with have such a fabulous reputation. For example, your congregation was very active in helping the people of Haiti deal with the natural disasters and dislocation that caused. But for the Ukrainian experience, there are analogies to our own American experience. In 1776, our Revolutionary War would have ended very differently if not for the support of France and other countries. 36 years later, the American people were able to consolidate their independence after Britain invaded, occupied our capital, and burned down the White House. And again, our soldier citizens forced the British out into what is now Canada. That again was done with very much foreign assistance. Thomas Paine wrote a very important and sea-changing pamphlet called Common Sense. And what he established was that America's link was not to Britain, it was to Europe. It was to the Enlightenment that was sweeping across Europe and the world, whereby scientific methods were replacing certain dogmas that were controlled by kings and popes. That change was what really brought our country, America, into total understanding of its role in the world. People like Nathan Hale, who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death. I fear only one, that I only have one life to give for liberty." These sentiments, these commitments, this ethos that inspired America to stand as an independent and sovereign state were repeated in other countries around the world at the same time, because Europe itself was going through a process of the birth of political nations, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire were crumbling. And what was to come in its place? And what came were nation states. And in the middle of this fervor, of this cross-continental reawakening and redirecting of societies and civilization itself was taking place in Ukraine as well. Ukraine had been under Russian occupation from after 1654 until 1918. This was a truly brutal occupation, to the extent where even the Ukrainian language was banned by orders from the Tsar. In other words, any expression of a Ukrainian identity was considered a hostile threat to the existence of the Russian Empire. And so people like Taras Shevchenko, whose anniversary we are celebrating today at our rally at the Ukrainian Cultural Center at 3 o'clock, he was a poet. And he was for Ukrainians what George Washington was for Americans. He wrote poetry that reawakened, reaffirmed, reinstilled in Ukrainians their understanding of themselves as a separate and distinct European nation. There were many others. Another one was Lesia Ukrainka, a poetess from that same era, who wrote, "We have faith without hope." That has stuck with me very, very strongly throughout my life, because in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, our society and our Sovietologists and our academic experts bought into the Russian narrative that Ukraine is a territory, not a people. That in fact, the Soviet man has come to be, and that there are no more nations, if you will, in the Soviet Union. Back in 1900, Mykola Mikhnovsky wrote his own pamphlet. It was called An Independent Ukraine. And that pamphlet, just like Nathan Hale's, created a fervor in Ukrainian society of the day, and the Ukrainian nation joined the transformations going on throughout Europe with the fallen empires and the establishment of independent nation states. And so when the World War I broke out, the Ukrainian people proclaimed their own independent country, and for 3 years, they fought the Red Army to consolidate their independence. At the peace negotiations in 1923 in Brest-Litovsk, Ukraine was denied recognition, and Ukraine was divided between Poland and Russia. Primarily, there were other countries involved. And so what did Stalin take from that signal? That he had a free hand. And so in 1932-33, by using the weapon of hunger, he committed genocide against the Ukrainian people. And according to the former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, upwards of 10 million Ukrainians were starved deliberately to death. Just contextually, that same year, the United States recognized the Soviet Union as a legitimate country and a legitimate state. 2 years later, the New York Times reporter Durante received the Pulitzer Prize for journalism for reporting that there was no famine, that there was no genocide, that this was all propaganda. So if you assimilate that information, you can better understand what people like my parents, who came after the Second World War as war refugees, what they were up against, and what really motivated our whole community was we were being denied that we exist by our own host country. And from that day forward, we developed a vast community network to fight for recognition of our very existence. So let's fast forward to today. For the last 8 years, Ukraine has been fighting a war against Russian aggression in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. 3, 4, 5 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, died every single week from Russian sniper rifles, from mortars, from howitzers, and so forth. The West was comfortable with that arrangement. It was a French war off on the fringe of the Ukrainian-Russian border. Now, it's bad, but we can work with that. And then when Putin last year wrote his 5,000-word missive about how there is no Ukraine and there's only Russia, and that Russia has to reclaim what is rightfully its. And then when he wrote just already this year that Nazis and bioweapons labs, and by the way, a non-existent fake country needs to be made right. And still, our country in the West tried to dismiss that as the ravings of Putin and so forth. And then came the invasion 2 weeks ago. And every intelligence service in the United States, England, and elsewhere said Kyiv will fall in 2 days. We're going to have to deal with a Russian puppet in Kyiv. And it all comes together if you look at it from a historical context and in contemporary context. We can see that there is a penchant in the West to look away, to appease, to seek a way out that is without cost. You know, Winston Churchill once said about the United States in 1941, that the United States, America will do the right thing after it's exhausted all other options. And it seems that those prophetic words are really, really relevant today. Because hard as we try to be helping the Ukrainian people in the war, but at the same time staying out of the war is nothing more than a signal to Putin that what he's doing is definitely not enough to trigger a genuine engagement by the West in this war. Ukraine is ringed by almost halfway around its border, is ringed by almost a dozen NATO members on its very border. Ukraine is geographically dead center of Europe, because Europe goes from France and Spain to the Ural Mountains. Ukraine has a territory the size of France or Texas. It has a population of 44 million people. And NATO and America and the West are still treating this as some sort of increased conflict, but somehow separate geographically and politically from any major region of the world. And here I want to stop for a minute. I worked at the United Nations for 15 years. I saw how that organization functioned. I saw all of the horror in the world, from apartheid in South Africa, to the fate of the Palestinians, to what was going on in Asia, the Middle East, and so forth. I care about human life and I care about human justice. overseas and here at home. But on a practical level, Ukraine stands apart because one of the largest militaries in the world with nuclear weapons is waging a war of genocide against a huge country in the middle of Europe, with all of the interdependencies, economic and so forth, that has disrupted. You know, trying to insert the moral and ethical factor into this debate is easy to do, but hard to get to stick. And so we segue to the economic factor. Gas prices, disruptions, inflation, all of this. This all sounds to me like a precursor to the West again being 2 steps behind and totally not engaged. Putin said 2 days ago, the sanctions against Russia are a declaration of war. Yesterday, he said, providing Ukrainians humanitarian relief and military assistance is an act of war. And what we hear from London to Paris to Berlin and to the United States is, heaven forbid that we do anything that would be perceived as an act of war. Now, the question is, are they hearing each other? Are they hearing the Ukrainian people? Javelin missiles are fabulous against tanks. Stinger missiles are really great against low-flying helicopters. Neither can do anything about cruise missiles, about jets and bombers, much less about howitzers. Ukraine needs surface-to-air defenses, sophisticated defenses. It is so painful for me to watch the debate about those 29 Polish MiGs. To me, that's a Western false flag operation to divert attention from providing real material that Ukraine needs by, let's talk for 4 days about, is it Poland's fault? Is it America's fault? Is it an act of war? I mean, blah, blah, blah. It is a bit embarrassing as an American, and truly, truly outrageous as a Ukrainian. We have a huge, huge opportunity to put an end to efforts to revive the last empire in the world. The USSR was the last Russian empire in the world, and Putin's trying to bring it back. He's trying to bring it back by destroying a nation of 44 million people who were instrumental in the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the first place. And that's a separate story, and I won't take up your time with that. But right now, please donate to the charity of your choice, either one of ours or the International Red Cross or United Nations relief agencies or your own Episcopal relief drive. This is what we as Americans do, Americans of faith, Americans who care about their fellow man. We also ask you to contact your congressman and Senator Peters and Senator Stabenow and share with them your sense of how America should be involved and how America cannot let this criminal cabal in the Kremlin continue to parade around as a legitimate, sovereign, independent state and member in good standing of the Comity of Nations in the world. We need to finally bring this process full circle and make sure that not only the Ukrainian people are victorious, but that every nation inside the so-called Russian Federation will have its opportunity for its day in the light of self-determination and nation building for their own nations. This is a project that I'm also involved in. We're in touch with over 100 separate nations within the Russian Federation that are themselves fighting for their own rights. This is not a new project, but it certainly has gained a lot of urgency. But for us, Ukrainian Americans, for us Americans, the case is not, do we get involved or not? We are involved. The case is, are we going to proclaim ourselves a part of the struggle or a part of volunteers, part of 16,000 Americans have gone to Ukraine to fight. An organization I'm affiliated with in Canada has mobilized 2,000 Canadians to go to Ukraine and fight. Millions of packages of relief for the mothers and children of the soldiers have been sent. 2.5 million refugees as of today. 1.25 million of them are children, and the rest are their moms. Can we wrap our brains around that? Can we fathom how they parted with their husbands who are a part of the territorial defense forces of Ukraine? How they said goodbye and how they hope to return. These are stories that we Americans experience. I was a part of that generation, the Vietnam. I can't stop ever thinking about 50,000 of our finest young men dying in the jungles of Vietnam. I think about how the vast majority of them were are poor and who are from the racial communities of America. How unjust that was. How our country learned from that. How our country has tried to perfect its union. All of the trials and tribulations that we've gone through since the death of President Kennedy and his brother, of Martin Luther King, the changes that our society has instituted since then. And of course, they're not enough. But what do they reflect? They reflect a people finding their way to social justice, racial equality, and the promise that America held out and holds out to everyone who comes here. That promise must extend beyond our own borders. I've taken many delegations to the war zone in Ukraine over these 8 years. And one of the government officials said to me, you know, Boris, America can guarantee the safety and security of every American citizen. But the best we can do for the rest of the world is feel good and help support their aspirations. We don't guarantee anybody anything except Americans. Well, NATO is a guarantee. The EU has instituted a refugee program for Ukrainian refugees that has never been used. It was on the books. Every woman, child, and elderly man that has come into Poland and other EU countries has full social benefits, educational benefits, the right to work, housing, all of that. This was announced yesterday. The United States does not have a refugee program for Ukraine at all, of any kind. In Congress, they're beginning to talk about it. These are the types of disconnects that we often feel in America from the rest of the world. Our country, as a part of the Euro-Atlantic community, has to be on the same page with our allies. To be honest, Europe is ahead of the United States when it comes to confronting Putin. It really is. Germany is going to cut back 2/3 of its oil imports from Russia. That's off the charts. Switzerland, forever a neutral country, has declared itself supporting Ukraine with arms and humanitarian aid. Finland and Sweden are ready to join NATO. I mean, why is it so much farther ahead in Europe than here in the United States? Because it's that much closer. But is geography a factor anymore in this world? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. Let me conclude, as I'm hearing from my wife. Please give generously. If you know a Ukrainian, give them a hug. We're going through some really tough times. My wife and I were torn between dread and immense pride. We don't know which to occupy our minds at the moment. But right now, please give and ask others to do the same. Thank you.
I think there might be some questions or comments or.
I three real quick points I want to make, and I'll be kind of quick about. Number one, the speaker just mentioned genocide. I think that's a very realistic assessment. That word genocide has been misused in different times. It's not been misused in that context. One example, Mariupol, city in southeastern Ukraine, totally surrounded by Putin's forces, 300,000 people, mainly civilians, no food, no water, no electricity, no heating, nothing. Hospitals are blown to pieces. The Russians don't let anybody, or Putin's government does not let anybody into Mariupol, doesn't let anybody come out of Mariupol. People are beginning to die. This is genocide. And Mariupol is only one of many cities. And there's a horrible history, as our speaker said. Point number two, and speaking as an American, I'm embarrassed, frankly, to say this, but back in 1994, I'm not sure, I don't think we touched on this, but there was something called the Budapest Memorandum. The United States of America came to an agreement with the government of Ukraine, and the United States said, you get rid of your missiles. You get rid of your warheads, and we will guarantee you, we'll protect your national, your nation. The Ukrainians got rid of their missiles.
And the Russia.
Right, and now we made a commitment, and maybe it was a foolish one because maybe we never intended on doing it. Maybe we couldn't do it anyway. But the honor of our country, as an American, the honor of our country was, as a country, we gave our word, said, don't worry, we'll take care of your national security, give up those missiles. The honor of our country is involved with some. I'm not promoting a nuclear war, I'm not promoting World War III, I'm not saying we should be involved. It's very scary stuff, and we need to be really careful about all that. I totally agree. But the honor of our country to some degree is involved in this. We made a promise. You got to ask yourself, are we fulfilling our promise the way we're supposed to? Last point is, I brought a copy of a local Russian-American, it's an American newspaper. It's written in Russian for the Russian-speaking community. I mean, you might be familiar with this. Okay. And you can't read it, it's in Cyrillic unless you read Cyrillic, but in English, the point is, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, we blamed Japanese Americans. When Al-Qaeda bombed the Twin Towers, we blamed Arab Americans. We should not be blaming Russians per se, and certainly not Russian Americans, because Russian Americans, the ones I've known, I shop at a Russian store, I hear these people, and they're very sympathetic to Ukraine. It's not a Russian versus Ukrainian issue. It's a freedom versus tyranny issue. It's Putin's. The enemy, really, the adversary isn't the Russians, because 1/3 of Ukraine is Russian speaking, practically, I think. 90% of the Ukrainian population voted for independence. That included a heck of a lot of Russian speaking people. And also, Russians are suffering as much as Ukrainians are within the country. So it's not a Russian-Ukrainian issue. It's a tyranny, Putin's government against freedom-loving people of Ukraine. And it says here, we stand with Ukraine. This is a Russian-speaking newspaper. We stand with Ukraine. We get it as actually the English part of it. So, so don't blame Russians per se, especially not Russian Americans. That's my. And I'm done.
Just to add to that, we've had there was a Belarusian organized rally downtown last week in support of Ukraine. So to your point, that community is with us, right? But you see on the flip side where you've seen videos of, the propaganda going on in Russia, and people still do support Putin in that respect. And so it's a complicated issue, but locally here, we've had enough support from the Russian community. So
And let me add to that. Sons in Ukraine of moms and dads who are in Russia have called home and have told their parents what's going on. And their moms and dads tell them they're lying. The effort to hermetically close off Russia from the global media, is very akin to what was the Soviet Union. I saw my brother for the first time in 1990. I started talking to him about everything. He never heard of any. So when you think about how difficult it is for people to find their footing when they're in an information isolation, it is really, really terrifying. And when you think about the fact that Ukraine has been independent for 30 years, and for 30 years, Russia has done everything in its power, building democratic institutions of government, and nonetheless, Ukraine is still able to build them. They're no longer in their infancy. They're already functioning with great difficulty prior to the war. But for Putin, it isn't weapons. He's got all the weapons. His greatest fear is that Ukraine is a successful European democracy. That is the end of all of it when that happens. And ladies and gentlemen, it's going to happen. It's going to happen because the inevitability is there. The only question we have before us, at what cost? What cost of human life? I truly believe that the United States and NATO have to enunciate their policy and not leave it up to a veto of Putin to prevent it. It just boggles my mind that we can't say, yes, we will provide humanitarian aid. Yes, we will provide military aid. Yes, we will protect refugee corridors for women and children. I mean, for the president of the United States to effectively say, we will not do that because Putin doesn't want it, is beyond the pale. So yes, and then to your other points, you're absolutely right. The Budapest Memorandum was a sleight of hand, unfortunately, by the West to get the nuclear weapons out of Ukraine. And it would have been bad enough if they had gone to France, Britain, or the US. But the United States arranged for them to go to Russia.
Yep.
So, yes.
Well, I was at a meeting online a couple weeks ago where we're talking about this topic, and there were a couple women from the Ukrainian community who were speaking and gave us a nice information sheet of how we can help. But one of the things Haley Stevens said, on a practical note, if we're going to talk with our representatives or right, she suggested not using the term refugee or asylum seeker. She said displaced persons. Refer to incoming Ukrainians as displaced persons, and that might help with people coming over here. So just on a practical note, I don't know if you have any comments.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, she's been at our events and supportive. In our nucleus area of our community is Congressman Andy Levin, and he's been beyond marvelous in his support. What what Haley Stevens was talking about was current US law. And current US law does not address this crisis by even 5%. And so Secretary Mayorkas, the head of the Immigration and Naturalization in the United States, is supposed to come this week here, and Senator Gary Peters has arranged for us to meet with him to further discuss this issue. This is, I don't see where there is to discuss. These are war refugees. These are not displaced persons. You know, displaced people, our southern border is awash with displaced people. People fleeing fleeing regimes where there is no rule of law, where poverty is rampant, where people are threatened by gangs and so forth. That crisis on our southern border and really shows the paralysis in our government to deal with something of that magnitude. I really wish we wouldn't mix apples and oranges. There have been a number of members of Congress from the progressive movement who have gone so far as to say that Ukrainians are being treated better by Americans than the people on the southern border. There aren't even any in the United States. The only people who were given any consideration were Ukrainians with visas already in the US who are allowed to exceed their visas for a while. That doesn't address the question at all. And what Representative Jamal was talking about, I don't know. But something that cuts very deep to me is how both left and right are trying to exploit this unbelievable tragedy in their competition with each other. If there is one bright spot in all of this, it is tight, it is solid, it's not going to change. And it's really important for their caucuses, whether the right-wing caucus or the progressive caucus, somebody needs to talk to them and say, you're embarrassing us, you're embarrassing yourselves, you're embarrassing the Democratic Party, and you're embarrassing America. On the other side, I want to be fair. Former President Trump has done such great propaganda service to Putin that he's probably going to get him out right after Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
I feel confident that the passion aspect of what we heard today decides Southfield has very little power to accomplish a great deal. But that doesn't mean we don't have the means among ourselves to do what we're called to do. I suspect, I share your hopes. I share your intent for what should be happening. I believe it is past the moment that we're going to be able to do anything that will be able to prevent what's going to happen. The question, I think, arises that as much as Putin might want to eliminate I don't know how to phrase this, Ukrainianism, I don't think he's going to succeed. They're going to be, Ukraine's going to be a state in which the Russians are going to have great difficulty to rule once this so-called war has moved through the process and they try to docilize Ukraine, which means for those of us who take an interest, similar to what I know Jan and others have done in Haiti, this is not going to be a short-term reality. And I think the United States and those of us who care about any of this stuff need to recognize that we can't, what we give is not going to be for the next month and then thank you very much, it's all over. I think this is going to be years and years. And I'm reminded of craziness that happens. I happen to be the pastor for Charlie Wilson. Y'all remember Charlie Wilson's war? That Charlie Wilson, I was his pastor. Of all the people in the world who I would ever have suspected would ever be able to accomplish what he was able to do, it was not Charlie Wilson. And yet, look what happened. Unfortunately, he was right about the second aspect of that. He said we won the war and we effed up the peace in Afghanistan, the term he used. Here's the situation now, in my opinion, and you tell me if I'm wrong. The war will not be over simply because Ukraine's occupied. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, very, very fair.
Therefore, there will be opportunities in the future, possibly, and certainly maybe a new Charlie Wilson of some sort. And the pressure should remain on, in my opinion.
If I may.
Yes.
It's not
Pastor-
necessary, it's
Pastor-
not working.
Pastor Steve mentioned Afghanistan, and I think we need to address that as well. Afghanistan society functions as it did in the 6th century. Our country's efforts to speed up its evolution into a modern 21st century society was doomed from the get-go. The women of Afghanistan in the villages know nothing beyond their immediate, what I would call harem, where they service the village chief and his men from washing and feeding to sex and everything else. They know nothing else. Their pecking order is within that circle among themselves. There is no world outside of that. Ukraine is a modern 21st century European country. It has established democratic institutions. Thousands upon thousands of foreign students come to study there at its premier universities, where in Kharkiv, the most intensely populated city in Eastern Europe with educational institutions. I've been there many, and it's been in effect level. A city of 1,000,002 people. So that's why I was trying to share with you Ukraine's place in the world, while at the same time not diminishing the other tragedies around the world that deserve our help and need our help. I'm not separating Ukraine because it's a white European country. Please believe me. But what I'm trying to communicate is that Ukraine has advanced, has leapfrogged in these 30 years to a point of being ready to be a member of the EU, and the EU, day before yesterday, said that we are going to admit Ukraine. In other words, there is a process in life and in the world that can help you become a part of something greater than yourself. Faith is one of those things. But for societies, they grow, they develop their own ways in joining the world economy, joining the world society, world culture, and education, and so forth. Ukraine is there. That's what the war is all about. If Ukraine was still the way it was in 1990, Putin would not be waging war, trust me. Putin isn't waging war because Ukraine has NATO in its constitution. NATO's in no hurry to admit. So what is it? Why now? Because Ukraine has crossed the Rubicon. Ukraine has made the transition. And that means the end to Putin's regime and hence the war.
Any other comments or questions? I want to thank you all for taking your time and coming here. I think it was, for most of us, probably information we needed to have. I felt inspired by the passion in which you obviously care about culture. I won't say country per se, but your culture is great. I'm convinced that Putin is not interested in going back to the Soviet Union. I think he's convinced to go back to Tsarism.
Exactly.
That's where I think he's trying to go. And so neither one of those were ones I would like to be living under. So I encourage all to pass on to others in occasions of conversations that I think will happen periodically over the next few weeks to months, that you can share information that you have gained and have some of the facts rub off on you here to share with others. So thank you very much.
I just want to say. This is a reflection of what has happened with World War I. Don't leave World War I. We have stories. What it's like to go back to great-grandmother. My great-grandmother, we had siblings who were being silently in his book.
Can I just, a brief thing